Hello everyone. Welcome back to JeyBTechAcademy, and welcome to Lesson 10 of our SQL Server Mastery course. In our previous lesson, we explored the AND, OR, and NOT logical operators in depth. We learned how to use them individually and how to combine them to solve real-world business problems. But today, we're going to answer a question that confuses almost every SQL beginner. When a SQL query contains multiple conditions, how does SQL Server decide which condition to evaluate first? Does it simply read the query from left to right? Or does it follow a specific set of rules? The answer is SQL Server follows a predefined order of evaluation, known as operator precedence. Understanding this concept is extremely important because two queries can look almost identical. They can execute without any errors, yet return completely different results. In this lesson, you'll learn how SQL Server evaluates complex where conditions, how operator precedence works, and how parentheses help you control the evaluation order. Once you understand these concepts, you'll be able to write SQL queries that are not only correct, but also reliable and easier to understand. So let's get started and discover how SQL Server thinks behind the scenes. Lesson objectives. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to understand what operator precedence is, learn the evaluation order of NOT, AND, and OR, use parentheses to control the order of evaluation, avoid common logical mistakes in complex where clauses, write more accurate and professional SQL queries. If I write 3 conditions in a where clause, which one do you think SQL Server evaluates first? From left to right. Golden rule. SQL Server doesn't evaluate conditions the way we read them. It follows its own rules, and understanding those rules makes all the difference. Welcome back. In the previous lesson, we learned how to use the AND, OR, and NOT logical operators to filter data. Today, we're going to explore something that surprises almost every SQL beginner. Imagine 2 SQL queries. Both queries look almost identical. Both execute successfully. Neither query produces an error. But when you look at the results, they are completely different. How is that possible? If both queries are correct, why don't they return the same data? The answer is simple. SQL Server does not evaluate conditions based on the order in which we read them. Instead, it follows its own evaluation rules. These rules are called operator precedence. If you don't understand these rules, your query may execute perfectly, but still return incorrect results. This is one of the most common mistakes beginners make when writing SQL queries. In this lesson, you'll learn exactly how SQL Server evaluates multiple conditions inside a where clause. You'll understand why operator precedence is important. You'll also learn how parentheses help you control the order of evaluation and remove confusion from complex queries. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to write SQL queries that are more accurate, more reliable, and much easier to understand. Let's begin by discovering why 2 queries that look almost the same can produce completely different results. Let's look at a very interesting example. On the screen, you can see 2 SQL queries. At first glance, they look almost identical. Both queries use the same table. Both queries use the same conditions. Both queries execute successfully. There are no syntax errors. But when we look at the results, something surprising happens. The first query returns one set of records. The second query returns a completely different set of records. Now you might be wondering, how is that possible? If both queries are correct, and both use the same conditions, why don't they return the same results? The answer is that SQL Server does not simply read a query from left to right. Instead, SQL Server follows a specific order when evaluating multiple conditions. Even a small change in the way conditions are grouped can completely change the final result. This is one of the most common reasons why beginners get unexpected results from their SQL queries. Many developers think the query is wrong. But in reality, the SQL syntax is perfectly correct. The problem is the logic. Whenever you're writing a query with multiple conditions, don't just look at the SQL statement. Think about how SQL Server will evaluate those conditions. Once you understand the evaluation process, you'll be able to predict the result before you even execute the query. That is one of the most valuable skills for every SQL developer. In the next slide, we'll learn the simple rules SQL Server follows to evaluate multiple conditions, and you'll see exactly why these two queries return different results. Now that we've seen how two similar queries can produce different results, let's understand why it happens. The answer is operator precedence. Operator precedence simply means the order in which SQL Server evaluates multiple conditions. Just like mathematics follows a specific order when solving an expression, SQL Server also follows a predefined order when evaluating logical conditions. It does not evaluate conditions randomly. It does not evaluate them based on the way we read the query. Instead, it follows its own rules every single time. There are three logical operators that we need to remember: not, and or. SQL Server always evaluates the not operator first. The not operator reverses the result of a condition. If a condition is true, not changes it to false. If a condition is false, not changes it to true. After evaluating not, SQL Server evaluates the and operator. Remember, the and operator requires every condition to be true before a row is returned. Finally, SQL Server evaluates the or operator. The or operator returns a row when at least one condition is true. So the evaluation order is very simple. First not, second and, third or. This is the default order that SQL Server follows whenever multiple logical operators appear in the same where clause. Understanding this order is very important because it directly affects the final result of your query. Many beginners believe SQL Server evaluates conditions from left to right. But that's not how it works. SQL Server always follows operator precedence unless you explicitly change the evaluation order by using parentheses. In the next slide, we'll see a real example that demonstrates how adding parentheses can completely change the result of the same SQL query. Now let's see why parentheses are so important. On the screen, you can see two SQL queries. Both queries use exactly the same conditions. The only difference is that one query uses parentheses and the other does not. At first, this may not seem like a big difference. But in SQL Server, it can completely change the final result. Let's look at the first query. This query does not contain any parentheses. Because there are no parentheses, SQL Server follows its default operator precedence. It evaluates the and condition before the or condition. The query executes successfully. However, the result may not match what the developer actually intended. Now let's look at the second query. This time, the conditions inside the parentheses are evaluated first. The parentheses tell SQL Server exactly which part of the condition should be processed before the remaining conditions. As a result, SQL Server returns a different set of rows. Notice something very important. Neither query is wrong. Neither query contains a syntax error. Both queries execute successfully. The only difference is how SQL Server evaluates the conditions. This is why two queries that look almost identical can produce completely different results. Whenever you write complex where conditions, don't assume SQL Server understands your intention. Be explicit. If you want certain conditions to be evaluated together, use parentheses. They make your queries easier to read. They make your logic easier to understand. And most importantly, they help SQL Server return the exact data you expect. As your SQL queries become more complex, using parentheses becomes a good programming habit. It improves readability, reduces mistakes, and makes your SQL code much easier to maintain. Always remember this simple rule. When in doubt, use parentheses to make your logic clear. Now let's see exactly how SQL Server evaluates a query step by step. This is where everything starts to make sense. Instead of looking at the entire query at once, let's break it down into smaller steps. When SQL Server receives a query with multiple logical operators, it follows its predefined evaluation order. The first step is to evaluate the not condition. If the query contains the not operator, SQL Server processes it before anything else. After completing the not condition, SQL Server moves to the and condition. Here, every condition connected by and must be true for a row to qualify. Only after completing the and evaluation does SQL Server evaluate the OR condition. Finally, SQL Server combines all the evaluated conditions and decides which rows should appear in the result. Notice something important. SQL Server doesn't evaluate everything at the same time. It evaluates the query one step at a time. Each step builds on the result of the previous step. That's why understanding the evaluation order is so important. Now let's compare this with a query that uses parentheses. When parentheses are present, SQL Server always evaluates the expression inside the parentheses first. Only after completing the expression inside the parentheses does it continue with the remaining conditions. In other words, parentheses allow you to override the default evaluation order. They tell SQL Server exactly how you want the conditions to be processed. This makes your query much easier to understand and ensures that the results match your business requirement. Whenever you write complex where clauses, think about the evaluation order before executing the query. A few carefully placed parentheses can make your SQL queries more accurate, more readable, and much easier to maintain. In the next slide, we'll compare both queries side by side and clearly see how a small change in evaluation order produces different results. Now let's compare both queries side by side. At first glance, they look almost identical. They use the same table. They use the same conditions. They even execute successfully without any errors. But when we compare the results, we immediately notice a difference. The first query returns one set of rows. The second query returns another set of rows. So what changed? The answer is not the data. The answer is not the SQL syntax. The only difference is the order in which SQL Server evaluates the conditions. In the first query, SQL Server follows its default operator precedence. It evaluates the conditions based on its predefined rules. In the second query, the parentheses change the order of evaluation. They instruct SQL Server to evaluate a specific group of conditions first. Because the evaluation order changes, the final result also changes. This is a very important lesson for every SQL developer. Never assume that two similar-looking queries will always produce the same output. Even a small change, such as adding or removing parentheses, can completely change the result set. That's why professional SQL developers always write their queries with clear and intentional logic. They don't rely on assumptions. They make the evaluation order obvious by using parentheses whenever the logic could be misunderstood. This makes the SQL statement easier to read, easier to maintain, and much less likely to produce unexpected results. Always remember this simple principle. The SQL query may look correct. The syntax may be correct. The query may execute successfully. But if the logical evaluation is not what you intended, the result will still be wrong. Understanding operator precedence and using parentheses correctly will help you avoid these mistakes and write SQL queries that return exactly the data you expect. In the next slide, we'll look at some of the most common mistakes beginners make and learn how to avoid them. Now let's apply everything we've learned to a real SQL query. Understanding operator precedence is important, but applying it correctly is what makes you a better SQL developer. Let's look at the example on the screen. Instead of trying to understand the entire query at once, we'll evaluate it one step at a time. The first step is to evaluate the not condition. SQL Server first identifies all the rows that do not satisfy the specified condition. Next, SQL Server evaluates the AND condition. Only the rows that satisfy every condition connected by the AND operator continue to the next step. After that, SQL Server evaluates the OR condition. Any remaining rows that satisfy the OR condition are included in the final result. Finally, SQL Server combines all the matching rows and returns the completed result set. Notice how SQL Server follows the same evaluation order every time. First NOT, then AND, finally OR. Now imagine we add parentheses to the same query. The moment we add parentheses, SQL Server evaluates the expression inside the parentheses first. This changes the order of evaluation. And when the evaluation order changes, the final result may also change. This is why parentheses are one of the most powerful tools when writing complex SQL queries. They remove ambiguity. They make your intention clear. And they help SQL Server return exactly the data you expect. As you continue learning SQL, always develop the habit of reading a query step by step. Don't try to understand everything at once. Break the query into smaller logical parts. Understand how SQL Server evaluates each part. Then combine those results to understand the complete query. If you build this habit today, writing complex SQL queries will become much easier in the future. Always remember this simple rule. SQL Server doesn't guess what you mean. It follows the logic you write. So make your logic clear, and SQL Server will return the correct results every time. Now let's talk about some of the most common mistakes beginners make when writing SQL queries with multiple conditions. The first mistake is forgetting to use parentheses. Many beginners assume SQL Server will understand what they mean. Unfortunately, SQL Server doesn't guess your intention. It simply follows its operator precedence rules. If your logic is not clear, the result may be completely different from what you expected. The second mistake is assuming SQL Server evaluates conditions from left to right. This is one of the biggest misconceptions in SQL. Remember, SQL Server always follows its evaluation order. First NOT, then AND, finally OR. The third mistake is writing long and complicated where clauses without breaking them into logical groups. When a query becomes difficult to read, it also becomes difficult to maintain and troubleshoot. Using parentheses makes your logic much clearer. Another common mistake is focusing only on whether the query executes successfully. Many beginners think that if there are no syntax errors, the query must be correct. But that's not always true. A query can execute perfectly and still return incorrect data if the logical conditions are wrong. One more mistake is not validating the results. Never assume the output is correct. Always compare the returned rows with the business requirement. Ask yourself a simple question. Did this query return exactly the data I wanted? If the answer is yes, your logic is correct. If not, review your conditions and check the evaluation order. Professional SQL developers don't just write queries. They carefully think about the business requirement. They write clear logical conditions. They use parentheses whenever necessary. And they always verify the results before using the data. If you develop these habits from the beginning, you'll avoid many common SQL mistakes and write queries that are accurate, reliable, and easy to understand. Always remember this simple principle. Correct SQL syntax helps your query run. Correct SQL logic helps your query return the right data. Congratulations! You've successfully completed Lesson 10 of our SQL Server Mastery course. In this lesson, you learned one of the most important concepts in SQL. You learned how SQL Server evaluates multiple conditions inside a where clause. We started by understanding why two SQL queries that look almost identical can return completely different results. Then we learned about operator precedence and discovered that SQL Server follows a predefined evaluation order. First, it evaluates the NOT operator. Next, it evaluates the AND operator. Finally, it evaluates the OR operator. After that, we learned how parentheses can override the default evaluation order. By placing conditions inside parentheses, we can control exactly how SQL Server processes a query. We also compared queries with and without parentheses, and saw how a small change in the evaluation order can produce completely different results. Then we worked through practical examples step by step to understand how SQL Server thinks while executing a query. Finally, we discussed some of the most common mistakes beginners make and learned simple techniques to avoid them. Always remember that writing a SQL query is not just about using the correct syntax. It's about writing the correct logic. When your logic is clear, your results will be accurate. Whenever you write a complex where clause, take a moment to think about how SQL Server will evaluate each condition. If the logic is not immediately clear, use parentheses. They make your queries easier to read, easier to maintain, and much easier to understand. Now it's your turn. Open SQL Server Management Studio. Rewrite every example from this lesson. Experiment by adding and removing parentheses. Observe how the results change. The more you practice, the more confident you'll become in writing complex SQL queries. If you found this lesson helpful, please like this video, share it with your friends and colleagues, and subscribe to JeyBTechAcademy for more beginner-friendly SQL Server tutorials. Also, don't forget to turn on notifications, so you'll be the first to know when our next lesson is released. In our next lesson, we'll learn 3 powerful SQL operators that help us write shorter, cleaner, and smarter queries. We'll explore the IN operator, the between operator, and the like operator with practical examples and real-world use cases. Thank you for watching. Keep learning, keep practicing, and I'll see you in Lesson 11. Closing message. The best SQL developers don't just write queries. They understand the logic behind every query they write. See you in Lesson 11.